And again, welcome to the Zero Emission Bus Transition Plan Workshop. Tonight's agenda, we're going to go through some introductions, project background, Transit 101, some bus fleet history, and then start to overview our guiding principles that the project team has developed, followed by facilitated discussion. So tonight, introductions, I'm Dan Pfeiffer. I'm with Zan Associates. I'm leading the engagement portion for the project. With me tonight is Carrie Desmond. She is a project manager for Metro Transit and is leading the Zero Emission Bus Transition Plan. Gavin Poindexter is the project manager from AECOM. And then with me from Zan Associates is Bridget Bjorklund, who will help facilitate the discussion, and Rebecca Leeser, who is helping with discussion notes. So now I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to start the introduction to the plan and move through some of the background details.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. My name's Carrie Desmond. I'm the project manager at Metro Transit for the Zero Emission Bus Transition Plan. Ask Dan in the chat maybe to put the Mentimeter again. I think the question's still alive, and we'll capture the results if folks still want to add some comments in. So I'm going to start tonight with just an overview. Why are we doing this plan and why now? This is an effort that Metro Transit started working on actually last fall, so about a year ago now, with scoping out the project, doing procurement to get the consultant team on board to help us, and a lot of the early project definition work. But we kicked it off in earnest this past summer. And what we're trying to do is establish a framework that helps us in our decision making as we move forward, and helps kind of ground us in our next steps as we look at opportunities to transition our bus fleet to more zero emission technology. This plan is required by the state legislature, and we'll be submitting it to them in February of 2022. So it is a rather rapid project timeline, and we're cognizant of that, but it's also a living document that's going to be updated regularly. It's a very fast changing industry, and so it's something we'll keep updating as we learn more, but give us again that framework to point back to. Some of the key steps in the project or the process we're doing. Tonight, we're going to focus on the guiding principles. We've identified 3 different topics that we're focusing on. The first one being technical viability, ensuring that we can make our commitment to our riders that our service is reliable, and that the technology we choose is ready for the application. Equity and environmental justice, which we'll talk more about as the evening goes on, and that's going to be the focus of a lot of our discussion tonight. And financial impact, recognizing that there's higher upfront costs in particular for zero emission buses and fueling equipment. And then we're setting goals and milestones for the project with 3 different time horizons. So looking at the short term, what is the technology ready for today and in the next few years? Medium term looks at the latter part of the decade, and then long term kind of beyond 2030. And within those different time horizons, developing strategies of how this impacts our service and our operations. So we're going to start with just a little bit of kind of Transit 101 or some basics to make sure we're all kind of grounded in the same vocabulary for tonight. So I'm going to start with the different types of service that Metro Transit operates, and then we'll touch on a few other items as well. The first one you may be familiar with is bus rapid transit. You may be familiar with lines like the A line or the C line, as well as the orange line that's opening in December this year. And this is a service that's frequent, it's all day. It tends to have wider stop spacing, which allows oftentimes a higher running speed, and comes with other amenities like upgraded stations and shelters. Local service is probably what you think of running on your average neighborhood or city street. Again, it's an all-day service, but it has less space between stops, so it stops more often. And that oftentimes leads to a lower average speed for the vehicle. And the last one I'll touch on is express and commuter service. And this traditionally operates during morning and evening rush hour, really focused on getting commuters to employment centers. And oftentimes, for at least a portion of the route, runs on highways. So again, kind of a higher average running speed. The other term that's going to be really critical to our discussion today is blocks. And a block, we're going to talk about blocks as opposed to routes today. Routes is more akin to maybe what you think of as the rider of where you're trying to go, but a block is what a bus does in a day. And that's really critical when we're talking about zero emission buses, because we have to make sure that whatever bus we select can complete the block it's assigned for the day. So some of the things that are different when we're thinking about a block as opposed to a route is the bus may have multiple operators in a day. It may cover multiple routes in a day. And so even though you may think about a person shift, the bus operator being out for 8 to 10 hours in a day, the bus may be out for 18 to 20 hours in a day. Thinking about some of our blocks, the graphic on the right is 3 examples of blocks. So each color is a different representative block within the system, and all of those are covering multiple routes. We've got about a little over 670 blocks on a typical weekday, and those are covering about 145 different routes. There's also a lot of variation in the length of a block. So our shortest one is about 10 miles and our longest one is 345 miles. And kind of the average is around 130. So thinking back to the different types of service I mentioned a minute or two ago, our bus rapid transit and our local service often have some of those longer blocks, while express service a lot of times is shorter blocks. And the last definition I'll touch on is just what we mean when we're saying a zero emission bus. This is zero tailpipe emissions. Oftentimes battery electric, or another emerging technology is hydrogen fuel cell. But with our climate here in Minnesota and the colder weather we get, it is necessary to have auxiliary diesel heaters on board to help maintain the temperature in the cabin of the bus without having significant impacts on the battery capacity and ultimately how long the bus can drive for a day. I also want to touch on briefly in our overview here some of the history of different steps Metro Transit's taken to reduce emissions in our fleet, as well as some of our facilities. The zero emission bus transition plan is the next step in our journey, not the first step. So starting in the 1990s, that was the first time that we used bus only traffic on highway shoulders, and that allowed us to reduce idling and rush hour traffic and really increase the speed that some of our express routes in particular can travel. In the early 2000s, that's when we introduced the first hybrid electric buses into our fleet, as well as with the Metro Blue Line opening, the first fully electric light rail vehicles. And then as we continued looking at ways to help improve the efficiency and reduce emissions of the fleet, a big step was in 2007 when we introduced particulate matter trap filters on the buses. And the reason that's significant is it allowed us, when we think about the emissions of our diesel buses today compared to where we were at in the 90s, to reduce those emissions of particulate matter by about 96%. So a very significant reduction in those emissions over the last several decades. And then the next step came in 2010, looking at reducing nitrous oxide emissions with the diesel fleet. So by introducing the use of diesel exhaust fluid, we were able to reduce the emissions of the diesel fleet compared to, again, in the 1990s by about 94%. We also continued adding hybrid electric buses to the fleet over the last decade, and ones with greater efficiency as well. In addition, we had the opening of the Green Line, which added more light rail vehicles that are fully electric. And when we look at the last few years, some of the most recent steps, in 2016, we were able to add the first non-revenue electric cars to our fleet. These are vehicles that staff use to help support service. And one that's particularly proud of, in 2019, we introduced the first battery electric buses on the Metro C line in the fleet. And that's really allowed us to get a great amount of experience and learned a great amount with that pilot project, which is helping inform the next steps we take across the system. And the last one noted on here, we have a 6th bus garage currently under construction in the North Loop neighborhood that's slated to open in early 2023, which will be our most energy efficient facility when it opens, and also has a number of sustainability features in that facility. So the last piece here in kind of this overview, you can see on the left some of the statistics about the makeup of our fleet today, the different propulsion types, the different sizes of buses. And it's also noteworthy to understand that the transit buses are in our fleet on average for 12 to 14 years. That's the typical life of a transit bus. And so this transition is going to take time as we work through when different vehicles are due for replacement and we have the opportunity to transition. On the right side of the slide, you can see some of the proposed funding in the coming years for electric buses. Our 2022 to 2027 capital improvement plan is currently out for public comment with the council. And you can see some of the different plans we have in place in the coming years. What I will note is that as we continue to develop this zero emission bus transition plan, that's really going to inform year over year as we do our next capital plans, the steps we take and the opportunities we have to transition. And that's going to be informed by not only funding availability, but also the technical viability. Are these vehicles and charging equipment ready to be introduced into the fleet? So I'll touch on high level 2 of the guiding principles, technical viability and financial impact, and then I'll turn it over to Dan to talk a little more about equity and environmental justice. The Metropolitan Council has a long-range plan called Thrive MSP 2040, and there's 5 pillars within it that you can see on the screen here. And zero emission buses really impact and help advance all of these priorities. So touching on the draft guiding principles that we're going to discuss more today, I've alluded to these different topics, but technical viability really means we're striving for a point where the propulsion type isn't how we're referring to the buses anymore. It's a bus and it can do what it needs to do to meet its service requirements. So we're out there providing reliable service to our riders. Equity and environmental justice, there's 2 pieces we're focusing on here. The first being transparent community engagement and education on what we're working on, which is part of the purpose of today's summit. And then also figuring out what are the different characteristics we're going to use to prioritize deployment with an equity lens. And then thinking about fiscal impact, recognizing that this is a more costly technology up front, being cognizant that we're able to operate and invest within our financial means. I'll touch on some of the benefits and challenges we've seen so far with our experience. Certainly a lower dependence on fossil fuels and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which are some of those comments we saw in the early Mentimeter question, as well as quieter vehicles and perception from riders that they're more comfortable. But with any emerging technology, it does come with its challenges, and we are an early adopter of electric buses. And we've had our share of challenges on the C line that has led to temporarily taking electric buses out of service for a period of time while we work to resolve primarily issues with the charging equipment. So it is important that we're learning from that experience and making sure that as we deploy more buses in the fleet, we're confident that they're ready to do so. And then transitioning to more of the financial aspect of this, investing in zero emission buses does align with the Thrive 2040 outcomes that I mentioned a moment ago. We're really looking to maximize our efficiency, reduce our fuel consumption, as well as expanding options for our riders. So I'll touch on a high-level comparison of the different costs depending on the size of the vehicle, looking at a diesel bus versus an electric, as well as the charging technology to make sure we can fuel the bus. So you can see from the chart here that there is a significant incremental cost increase for propulsion as well as the charging and fueling technology. The other piece we're learning about is what are the different considerations and costs associated with operating and maintaining this new technology. No one in North America at this point, none of our peers have had an electric bus for its full life cycle. So that's something that we're all still learning together. And until us or one of our peers has really used an electric bus for that full 12 to 14 year life cycle I mentioned up front, that remains an open question for us. But we are looking for all available funding opportunities to help us with this incremental cost, including potential partnerships with our electric utility, Xcel Energy, and the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, as well as applying for a number of different federal grant opportunities to help us with these costs. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan to walk us through the equity and environmental justice principle.
Thank you, Gary. So we're going to talk about equity and environmental justice as the guiding principle. And I wanted to start with a definition. So Thrive 2040, equity connects all residents to opportunity and creates viable housing, transportation, and recreation options for people of all races, ethnicities, incomes, and abilities, so that all communities share the opportunities and challenges of growth and change. And so many of you have probably seen this before or seen similar stats. So in our region, we do have inequities that exist. So we have the fourth widest disparity in high school graduation rate, the second widest disparity in employment rate, the widest disparity in household income and home ownership. And when we look at impacts from public health to climate change, those impacts tend to affect at the same groups that are affected by these inequalities. So they're linked together when we think about these. And so we really want to, in our decision making, be clear of how we are making decisions to reduce the inequities, to resolve the inequities, to focus our investments where they are needed. So some factors we need to consider, Metro Transit needs to consider as they implement zero emission buses. 44% of transit customers are people of color, 50% are under age 35, 47% have no working automobile, and 43% have a annual household income below 25,000. And if we just look at regional demographics and anticipated regional changes, in 2010, 24% of those living in the region were people of color. By 2040, about 40% in the region will be people of color. If we don't become a more equitable region, in 2040, we will have 124,000 fewer people with jobs, 186,000 fewer homeowners, 274,000 more people in poverty, and almost 32 billion less in income. And so having equity and environmental justice as one of the guiding principles really gets to having a transparent decision-making process that is measurable, that we can look at the data behind it to make those decisions, and supports the executive orders listed here along with others. Team looked at the Met Council's equity considerations data set and identified the population characteristics and factors, environmental factors, that we as a team felt were measurable, were important to the decision-making process. So these included population density, percent Black, Indigenous, people of color, percent zero-car households, percent housing cost burdened, and the number of years, areas of concentrated poverty. And then on the environmental factor side, average land surface temperature on a hot summer day. Heat island, it's a way that oftentimes you'll hear it referred to, and lifetime cancer risk from inhalation of air toxics. And so as the team has pulled these out, really what we're here tonight, what we really want to gather feedback on is, how should we prioritize these, along with, are there others that we should consider? And so just to give you an example of how a measurable formula could work, if you had population characteristics multiplied by the environmental factors, you could create an equity score. So this was adapted from the Cal environmental screen. And so tonight, part of the items that we want to share is just some examples. So these are equity modeling examples. These are 5 different examples that the team put together using the data set that give different weightings and priorities to different factors. And we did this because we wanted to show people, as we think about the block and the regions, the bus blocks along with the regions, we want to show people kind of where those priority zones would be. And so on the maps, you'll see the data is in census tracts, but we've used neighborhoods as references to help show the data in this larger regional aspect. So looking at equal weights, so giving 20% to each of the 5 population characteristics and 50% to the 2 environmental factors, this is what the map would look like. This is what the prioritization score would be. So the gray is the 0 to 25, the light green is 25 to 50, the dark green is 50 to 75, and the pink reddish is the 75 to 100. And if you overlay the example bus blocks that Carrie showed earlier, this is what it would look like. And so you can see kind of how these lay out and which areas would be prioritized for implementation. If we move on to giving a higher priority to areas of concentrated poverty, so we increase areas of concentrated poverty to 60% of the weight and decrease the other population characteristics and keep the environmental factors at 50-50. These are the areas that it would change to. So if I go back, hold on. If I go back, you can see as I click through, you can see where the red and dark green change. That's probably the most obvious to see. So we'd see an increase in North End, Frogtown, Payne Phelan. We'd see some decrease in St. Anthony Park, Marcy Holmes, North Loop, U of M, downtown Minneapolis. And so if you overlaid the bus blocks, here's how that would look. If we created a prioritization towards the BIPOC community, gave that 60% of the weight, reduced the others in the population characteristics and the environmental factors, here's where that would lay out. So increase in Hamlin Midway, University of Minnesota, near north, decrease Lindale, Kingfield. If we started to give a priority to one population characteristic and one environmental factor, so population characteristic for the BIPOC community, and then weighting cancer risk at 90%, we'd see an increase in Dayton's Bluff, West Side, decrease in Payne Phelan. You can kind of see how that lays out. It shifts that area. And then finally, if you looked at concentrated poverty and cancer risk, so going to the same kind of 60% for areas of concentrated poverty and a cancer risk at 90%, you'd see the increase in West Side community, near north, U of M, Marcy Holmes, downtown, West 7th. And so we created these as a way to have a conversation about prioritization for different categories, along with, are there others that we should consider, that the project team should consider? So with that, we're going to move into the discussion portion of the presentation. And here we really want to hear from you. If you were able to decide the characteristics how to get prioritized, that's where it really, what we're trying to gather from you tonight. Now I kind of want to talk about some of the next steps and how you can stay involved in this process. So we will be targeting outreach to neighborhood organizations, mostly, some of the neighborhoods that we identified through our initial equity prioritization. We will be looking at that and reaching out to neighborhood organizations. There is an online survey. If you go to metrotransit.org/electric buses, it is linked there. It is also linked in the chat. It's a short survey. It's a few questions long and includes a ranking prioritization, similar to what many of you completed tonight. We ask that you share that with your networks. That will help us identify what we should prioritize, how we should prioritize implementation in a transparent way. We are going to continue our technical analysis and submit the zero emission bus transition plan to the state legislature by February 15th, 2022. Again, how you can help, you can learn more at the website. You can share the online survey with your network. Please, we ask that you share it. And if you have a question, if you'd like staff to share an overview with your neighborhood organization, please reach out to me. When you signed up for the meeting, you received an email. It has my contact information in it. It is also, I'll put it in the chat. If you'd like to schedule a presentation and chat with your organization to help gather input into this process, please reach out. The survey will be open through November, so November 30th. If there are no other kind of final thoughts on the transition plan, or your thoughts on what priorities how we should prioritize, how Metro Transit should prioritize implementation, we do really thank you for attending tonight. And we thank you for your input into the process, and we hope that you stay engaged in this process. As Carrie said, this plan is a living document, so this is the first step in the process. Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.